Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Lynn Philip Hodgson. And I just finished a book he wrote, a fascinating book, World War II book that he wrote. Title of the book is Inside Camp X. And this is not his first book. He's written many books. Titles are Secret Agent Extraordinaire. Another is Word of Honor, Camp 30. Another is Silver Dagger. Then two, Camp X Final Battle and Vengeance Weapon. Also, Dispatches from Camp X, Ajax, Arsenal of Democracy, Mills of the Gods, and then a new one that just came out is titled The Birth of Special Operations in Canada. And his website, where you can read about his books and himself, is www.camp-x.com. And I will include that in the show notes so you can just link right on through. But Lynn was born in the city of Toronto, Ontario, Canada in 1946. When he was 13, his father purchased an amusement park in Pickering, Ontario, and named it Paul Lynn Park after Lynn and his brother Paul. It was there in Pickering that the brothers grew up. He married his high school sweetheart, Marlene, and they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 2014. They are the proud parents of two married daughters, and they retired to Burlington, Ontario. And he's the author of this best-selling book, again, Inside Camp X. He was a successful businessman for 35 years, working for Johns Manville Corporation. Among his achievements was the design and implementation of the first distributed integrated computer system called CSS early in the 1970s, which was to become the basis for most online computer systems used in business today. He was director of business logistics while working for a subsidiary company in Quebec with a large project team under his supervision. He has spoken to over 100,000 public and high school students in the past 10 years, enlightening them to their rich historical heritage here in southern Ontario. He was a volunteer at the Camp X Museum in Oshawa and is past chair of the Scugog Shores Historical Museum, past vice chair and director of the Kawartha Region Conservation Authority, or the KRCA, director of the Military Heritage of Durham Region. He's also elected municipal councillor for Ward 3 in Scugog Township for over 7 years and was chair of the Powerful Finance Committee and Works Committee. But again, we're going to talk about this fascinating book, which I've read through. Like, I love World War II books. And this was something I wasn't that familiar about. Justin Bizot of the Divulgence podcast told me about this book and sent me a copy of it. So I was able to read through it in its entirety and really learned a lot. So I'm delighted to have the author today. So Lynn Philip Hodgson, welcome to the show. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, William. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So for people who may not have read your book or heard, I mean, this additional background, can you talk about, I know you grew up in the area where this camp was, but can you talk about your interest and what led you to write this book, Inside Camp X?
Yes. Yeah, I've always had an interest in World War II. Of course, when I was born, it was just shortly after World War II was over. And I grew up with many of the soldiers who went overseas and fought in that war. And as a matter of fact, I remember vividly that when I was young, it was an obligation of yours to attend a Remembrance Day service every November the 11th. And there would be a parade, and we would literally watch thousands of soldiers march by. But you'd have the day off school, but you had to attend that Remembrance Day service. And there were thousands out there for it. So that was my interest that got me started in this particular venture that I got into. Plus the fact that when A Man Called Intrepid came out in 1976, my wife and I, Marlene, we were living in Whitby, which was a stone's throw away from Camp X, of course, unbeknownst to us. So after reading the book, there was a natural interest there to find out more about it. And I started to do research, and I was amazed that nobody else was doing this at the time. So I jumped on the opportunity, and it's been an amazing tour, that's for sure.
Right, and I think on your website, it just has in the opening page that you've been researching Camp X for over 40 years. And for people who don't know, A Man Called Intrepid was about a very important figure during World War II by the name of William Stephenson. And he got that name supposedly from Churchill, right?
Correct. Yes, he got the intrepid part of the. It was on the front of all the teletypes that were going back and forth between Camp X and Bletchley Park in England. So it was a lead to the teletypes.
Gotcha. So that was kind of his code name. And can you
Right.
talk for people, the locale, like you grew up kind of in that area? Can you talk about the location of this camp and how it got started and why it got started?
Yeah, this area, which is called Durham Region, has a population now of 860,000 people. Back then, it was mostly farmland back in the 40s. And but during the war, it was very, very rich in talented people who obviously got involved in the war immediately in all different aspects of it. But for example, just 6 miles west of me is the town of Ajax, and it was called DIL, Defense Industries Limited. There, 9,000 women filled over 40 million shells. It was the largest ammunitions plant in the British Commonwealth. And then, of course, there's Camp X just down by the lake. And then just another 6 or 7 miles to the other side is Oshawa Airport, where they trained over 2,000 pilots who would go on to fly Hurricanes and Spitfires and Lancasters. And then just another 10 miles to the east of that was a German POW camp where they had over 800 senior German officers, including 3 German generals in turn during the Second World War. So the whole area was very, very rich in staging soldiers for going overseas.
And what was the purpose of this camp? It definitely had a designation, kind of a secret designation. I think it was STS 103. It got the designation Camp X later, but why was it created?
Okay, why was it created? Very interesting question, because it was one question that was in my mind for a long time, to find out the who, why, when, where, and how of Camp X. What world event caused someone to create a camp here in little old Whitby on the shores of Lake Ontario, and what purpose did it have? What was the intention? All those questions came up, and my research took me to the fact that, and this is definitely documented in many articles, but it goes back to the Battle of Britain, and that's because Churchill knew that Great Britain was going to be occupied by the Germans as soon as Operation Sea Lion would take place on November the 1st of 1940. And that was going to be the 100,000 fighting soldiers coming across the English Channel with an armada of ships and landing on the shores of England and occupying Great Britain, just as they had done with so many countries before that. So in complete desperation, Churchill came up with a couple of things that he had to do immediately as the Battle of Britain was taking place over the skies of London. And that was to, first of all, put into place an operation which was called Operation Fish. And it was a number of destroyers that took all of Britain's gold reserves across the Atlantic to be housed in one of the banks in the bank in Montreal, and in the basement, which it did. It came over, was housed there all during the war. And then the second thing he did was he created something called the SOE, the Special Operations Executive. And that was they call it ungentlemanly warfare. Kids' gloves off, Queensberry rules of fighting out the window. Anything goes, including assassination. So in my book, I think you probably saw that I referred to Camp X as an assembly line for secret agents. And that's because when Stevenson had his operations, the BSC, the British Security Coordination in Manhattan, New York, he established a big operation there. And one of the things he had to do was create this camp in Canada, and the problem, of course, was that the United States was still neutral at the time.
Right.
So he had to hire a lot of people for his operation, but he couldn't hire Americans, and so he had to come to Canada and recruited over 2,000 women that would ended up working for Stevenson's operation, both at Camp X and at New York. So that's how it got started. And then, of course, the assembly line, as I mentioned, the assembly line, the SOE in England would send him a teletype to New York and say, we need, let's say, 12 Yugoslavs to be sailing for England in September, and they need to be trained in course E. Well, that would tell Stevenson right away the type of course that they had to be trained in. So his people in Toronto, at their headquarters in Toronto, would have to go out and find these recruits to be trained at Camp X as secret agents, and then get them trained in time to be sailing to England.
Right.
So it was quite an organization.
Right. Really fascinating. And I think that you said that it was very fortunate in its locale because there were different ethnic groups that were involved in World War II that they could draw on to.
Exactly. Yeah, Toronto has, and still does today, has large pockets of ethnic backgrounds of Canadians that new Canadians who came over from European countries after the First World War. So after the First World War, they came over with their families, and they would be, say, 10 to 12 years of age, and educated here, but also spoke the language of their home that they came from. So let's say Yugoslavia, Hungary, Italy, etc. And so very large pockets of numbers of into 100,000, because they had these. Toronto's very vast like that, where they've got little Italy, little Hungary, and it's pretty easy to go in there and recruit someone, just as they've done today with the Ukraine. A lot of Ukrainian Canadians have gone back to fight in the war today. So very similar situation. It's very easy to recruit these people because they're very dedicated and adamant of what they want to accomplish. So it wasn't a difficult thing to recruit these agents during the war.
And they had the camp was an interesting layout because it wasn't obvious to the standard locale or people who lived around what was going on inside there, correct?
Right, but it was very easy to hide because as a matter of fact, one of the letters in the back of my book, declassified top secret documents that I got out of Kew in England. I went twice to England, and some from NARA in Washington. But one of the documents was from the first commandant, Roper Skillbeck, when he arrived, and he wrote a letter to General Constantine. Well, General Constantine was a Canadian. He was in charge of the liaison between Camp X and England. And so he wrote a letter to him saying that he'd never been to Canada before. He said, I'm shocked to see that this camp is not way up in northern Ontario in the woods, but here on the shores of Lake Ontario, right beside the town of Whitby and the city of Oshawa and the huge city of Toronto. And he said, I understand your concerns. Wrote a letter back to him. I understand your concerns. And I have a suggestion for you. And the suggestion was for him to open up the gates and invite the press in, take them for a tour. And he said, that's a great idea. And he did that. And I interviewed a man named Ford Lindsay. He was on that tour. And this was some years ago, way back in the 70s when I was doing most of my research. And he was on that tour, and I interviewed him, and he said that he met the colonel at the gate with a number of others from Toronto. He was working for the Oshawa Times at the time. And he said that the colonel was very nice and polite and showed them around. He said, "Oh, you're going to see all kinds of vehicles coming and going, army jeeps, that type of thing, staff cars, people in uniform, which was not unusual to see at the time, and they're going to be coming and going, and also." He says, those rhombic antennas over there in that field, we leased that land to the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And he said, you're going to be hearing all kinds of explosions. He said, don't worry about it. We're testing new weapons for the war effort. So they bought onto it. And every time somebody called the newspaper and said, what the hell's going on down there? They would say, don't worry about it. They're just testing new stuff. And that's the way it stayed throughout the whole time. But it did get the name Camp X from the areas and the people in the area, the locals, the farmers, and everyone in the town of Whitby, because they knew what was going on. They knew something was big. It was a big secret. You weren't allowed to go in, and so they named it Camp X, and the X stood for mystery, the mystery camp, because it didn't have a name.
Right, didn't really have a name. It had some military name, but also it was open the day before the bombing at Pearl Harbor, right? So
yeah,
it was fortuitous.
Well, that's very interesting too, because as I was doing my research, I found out that, and this is again declassified top secret documents that I have in my possession. I found out that one of the letters was written on December the 6th, 1941, and it was from Rupert Colbeck writing a letter to say that morning, to say that he had arrived safely and was telling General Constantine that things were operational. But that afternoon, he received a teletype from New York saying that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor and that the United States had declared war on Japan, and now they were in the war. Previous to that, as part of the Lend-Lease agreement, Roosevelt, and as you know, Churchill was desperate for the Americans to get into the war.
Right.
So he was constantly after Roosevelt to provide something. So through Lend-Lease, of course, he did. But he said, "There's another way I can help you." When they had their meeting, he said, I can supply you with manpower. You can do whatever you want with them, but soldiers and young men, good shape, that type of thing." And he said, "Now they cannot be trained in the United States. They must be in either Canadian or British uniform. They must have identification of a Canadian or British person. And basically, they no longer exist once they leave here." And so that was all set up. And there's a place called, on the American side at Niagara Falls, there's a place called Roosevelt Beach. Roosevelt Beach was a staging area for these agents. It was a military camp. But it was a staging area for these agents. They were all being prepped. They were all ready to go. And what they were going to do is they were going to come across the Lake Ontario under the cover of darkness, and you could land right on the shores of Lake Ontario at Camp X, and walk up the hill, and you were inside the camp. So it was a perfect setup. Well, of course, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, it changed the whole ball game. They no longer had to do that. They could come up by train. They could fly into Oshawa Airport in uniform. They could drive up across the Peace Bridge. It was a whole new ball game after that had happened.
Right. And can you talk? I mean, if some famous people went through there, Ian Fleming had an experience through Camp X, the author of the Bond series. But can you talk about the program and what the training was like, and some of the characters? There were a variety of different people who trained different skills for these agents, right?
Yeah. Well, yes, and that's a good point, because in Britain they had some 50 or so of these various camps, but they were all unique. So, for example, Manchester, England had Ringway, which was parachute jumping, and that's all you did there. Bletchley Park had signals, Morse code. And of course, that's all you did there. And then a school called Bewley, that was for sabotage. So they had all these different camps, but of course, with Canada, that wasn't that just didn't fit into the cards. It wasn't going to work. So what they had to do was send experts over here. So when Roper Callbeck came over, the commanding officer, he brought all of his people with him, and they were all experts in one of these fields. So, for example, they had one guy was an expert in explosives. Another guy was small arms weaponry. William Fairbairn, the most talented silent killer in the world at the time, was there at 59 years of age, brought out of retirement, sent straight to Camp X to train men who were 20 years of age. Morse code signals, of course. So they had a staff of about 15 senior officers who were all experts in all these fields that I'm mentioning. And of course, that would take care of all the training that the agents would require behind enemy lines.
And how long was the program for the agents that passed through there? I mean, it was kind of almost like basic training or something, right?
Well, there were different. They went to basic training in Camp Borden, which is about 40, 50 miles north of here. So they went to Camp Borden first for basic training. Then once they graduated from that, then they were sent to Camp X and all set up ready to go. But once they got to the camp, as I was mentioning, SOE would put in a requirement for some particular area that they needed. And so they had A, B, C, D, E types of syllabus for the camp. And so A could be 2 weeks training, B could be 4 weeks training, and so on, and then down to E, where you would have 12 weeks of very competitive and repetitive training in all of the areas that I mentioned. And that usually meant that you were going to go in and you were going to be in there for some time. You were going to be there for a long time. I mean, behind enemy lines.
Right. So they were going to send you right into the kind of warfare. But it wasn't just about training. There was also a very significant component about communications and this whole Hydra thing. Can you talk about that as well?
Yeah, communications was the Hydra operation. It was it was the most powerful radio in the Western Hemisphere at the time. It was built by hand by a man and his team of operators. Man named Pat Bailey, Benjamin DeForest Pat Bailey, a Canadian, and very brilliant man, absolutely brilliant. And he actually, once he got up and operational, completely operational at the camp, he invented a machine called the Rock X. And it was actually named after the Rockettes of Manhattan, where he was had his office with Bill Stevenson, of course. So he built this Rock X. It was never broken by the Japanese or the Germans during the entire war. It was the one machine that was never broken by either side. So he created all of that himself, and then of course another colorful fellow was, as you mentioned, Ian Fleming. Ian Fleming was there in August of 1943, and he was there with a group of people that were under him called AU 30, and that was Assault Unit 30. So they were what you would call Navy SEALs, and their expertise, of course, was all underwater. They were training at the camp in Lake Ontario with one-man subs. And what they were doing, of course, was attaching limpet mines underneath the hull of a freighter that would be moored just off the camp. So that's, of course, where he obviously picked up much of what he had in the early James Bond movies. And then there were a couple other colorful guys that were there. Paul Dane. Paul Dane was a screenplay writer before the war, and he taught political warfare, called PWE, political warfare executive, and that was fighting the war with your mind. And I liken it to a game of chess where you've got to be 3 moves ahead of your opponent, at any given time. And it was how to outsmart the Germans and how not to be captured. And if you were captured, how to basically fight with your mind and not weapons, because you obviously wouldn't have any.
Right. So there was all kinds of training going on. People were going off into, drop missions, Yugoslavia, Tito, and all that. Can you talk about some of the missions these agents were sent on?
Everything you can imagine, including assassination. One mission that I wrote about, a fellow named Joe Galeni, his mission was to go into Hungary and actually try to convince the president of Hungary to switch over and not have the allegiance that they had at the time, or supposedly in Adolf Hitler, but to come over to the Allied side. His job was to convince him that the Germans were going to lose the war, and he could help by making it happen faster by coming over and joining the Allies. So that was a typical mission. Another one was sabotage, where they would actually go in and blow up a Messerschmitt factory or something like that. Obviously, very dangerous missions. Others were recruitment. They trained a lot of women, not at Camp X, but in the schools that I mentioned in England. And they were trained early on in the war to go into France. They actually had the greatest number of losses because of how dangerous that work was. The Gestapo were so strong in Paris and France that they could easily pick up some of these agents, and of course one would lead to another. So, but to go in and train and recruit the Maquis in France. So that was typical. When they were dropped with a canister. When they parachuted in behind enemy lines, a canister was dropped with you, and it was full of uniforms and weapons and everything that you would need to fight and train the recruits. I mentioned assassination. That is a fact. The SOE, Special Operations Executive, successfully assassinated a man named Reinhard Heydrich, the Butcher of Prague, they called him. He was the protector.
That was supposed to be Hitler's second in command. That was the person who was going to take over.
Absolutely he was. And when Hitler was going to take over the world, as it was his plan, then he would have retired eventually, and Heydrich was going to replace him. And he was absolutely ruthless. And so the Allies wanted him liquidated. And I actually have the documents of that whole plan of the training that was done, all the weapons that were sent with these two Czechoslovakian SOE agents, and the actual assassination. So everything you can imagine, everything you can think of was in play.
Right. So there was all kinds of missions, and it was interesting. You brought up Sterling Hayden was in the book. Who
right?
Was,
yeah,
that was
well. That's another interesting and great point. A lot of actors in Hollywood were part of this organization. Were part of what was called the British Security Coordination and the OSS. Julia Child was an agent with the OSS, and so a lot of Hollywood actors were involved. And the reason why they were involved is because they were going on those USO tours when the United States was neutral. And of course, they could get into a lot of these countries, or various countries in Europe, and they were briefed ahead of time by the OSS, and said, we want you to look out for this. We want you to note this, note that, document everything, bring it all back. And then they were debriefed once they'd come back home. So a lot of them played a huge role in that theater of war.
And there's just a lot of things going on. And it is interesting, like there were other kind of connections. You write about the connections to the POW camp, right?
Yes.
Bowman. Yeah. Can you talk about
Yes. 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 As you said, they were involved in everything and anything you can think of. Skillbeck was the third and final commanding officer of Camp X. Cuthbert Skillbeck, his name was, spoke fluent German. So what they came up with is a scheme where they would capture overseas a German officer who was highly involved. Let's say he was involved in the V1 and the V2 operations. And they got him as far away from Germany as possible because they didn't want these guys escaping. So they sent them all to Canada, and they also sent some down to Arizona, quite a few down to Arizona. But they sent them to this camp in Bowmanville, just not far from here. And so they would come up with a scheme where they would visit Skillbeck at the camp and say, listen, we need you to go in and pose as a new POW, and we need you to get close to this particular individual and find out as much as you can about what the guy was doing. And so he would do that, and of course he would fill out his report once he got back. But this type of thing where one day he's just being transferred to another camp in Alberta, for example, to get him further away from the war. So all of a sudden he'd be picked up by a truck and moved out that day. But he was naturally taken right back to Camp X, where he was actually the commanding officer.
Right. And so there were these connections with all the stuff going on in World War II. And can you talk about, I mean, you've done 40 years of research. Can you talk about how your understanding of this important training camp kind of unraveled for you?
How it
Well, I guess my question is like there's just, it seems like you keep running into people who give you information. People in the camp did your intro, you get letters, like you include a lot of narratives from other people's experiences in that camp, right?
Right. I did. I did a lot of research and interviews with. I interviewed everyone from Sir William Stevenson himself, Tommy Drewbrook, his second in command, who was the headquarters director in Toronto, Eric Kerwayne, aka Bill Simpson, was a very good friend of ours for many years until the day he passed away, and he was the chief recruitment officer for Camp X. So, of course, much of the information I received came from him, and so many others. I had friends who were in the Hydra operations. I had friends who were actual agents. Two of them that I wrote about in my book, in particular, Joe Galeni and Andy Dervitz, were both Hungarian agents, Hungarian Canadians, but trained at Camp X, lived locally, not far from where I am right now, and lived locally, sent overseas, sent on a mission into Hungary. Both were captured. Both were taken to German special SOE camps and brutally tortured by the Gestapo in horrible ways, and then managed to escape, and through MI9 and the escape route through the Pyrenees, were able to make it back to England successfully, and then, of course, after the war, back to Canada, where I was lucky enough to meet them because they both lived to a good age. So a lot of situations like that.
A lot of firsthand accounts of what happened there. And you have a website too with all your books and all the information as well too, right?
Right. It's camp-x.com. So camp/x or -x.com. And my email is info@camp-x.com. And it's also on the website.
Yeah. So
And
the
I have a
contact information.
Facebook page that I do a lot of posts about Camp X and other camps. Facebook page is Lynn Philip Hodgson. Yeah. So.
And so, where's the best place to get this book, Camp X?
Inside Camp X, you can get it on the website. You can download it in an ebook if you wish, and you can get it in a paper copy from me directly. My wife handles that. She takes the books to the post office and mails them out within a day of receiving an order. So it's just a simple matter of emailing saying which book it is that you want to have. If it's the ebook, you can download it instantly. And all the ebooks are exactly the same as the printed copy. They all have photographs, the same photographs in them. Inside Camp X has over 100 photographs with comments.
Right. So you've got a very well researched book. I got a signed copy myself of Inside Camp X, very thorough book. And then the website too, you can see videos of interest. You can see things for students, walking tours. So there's a ton of other information there as well. But can you talk a little bit about, before we wrap it up, about the other books you wrote that involve Camp X?
Yeah, I can. I got into a lot of trouble writing Inside Camp X. Of course, you're talking about a top secret topic. And as many people have done over the years, if you don't know that you've got things that are still classified as secret, and you don't find out about that until somebody contacts you. So I got into a lot of trouble with Inside Camp X, and so much so that the next book that I wrote was called Camp X the Final Battle. And so with that one, I said, well, I'm going to write this as faction so that the reader won't be able to tell what's fact and what's fiction. So I brought things back to life, actual events that happened, brought them back to life with characters, assumed names and whatnot of the real people, and took it into a narrative. And one particular thing was an assassination that took place at the camp. And I didn't want to write it as nonfiction because, again, of the trouble I got into with the first book. Writing that one is factual nonfiction. So I wrote it as faction, and it was great because it just worked out perfectly. So all of those books are actual events that took place that I've brought back to life with individuals playing the roles.
Gotcha. So there's their faction that's Final Battle, Vengeance Weapon, and Dispatches from Camp X. So there's more stories.
Dispatches is there's three books that are nonfiction. Inside Camp X, Dispatches from Camp X, and the history of special operations in Canada. Those three books are nonfiction. And the first book deals with what I learned from 1976 to 1999 when I published the book. Dispatches went from 1999 to 1999 to 2011. Sorry, 2011. And then the third book was 2011 to the present. So it tells the three books tell the complete story, day one to the end.
I see. And then the new one that just came out is The Birth of Special Operations in Canada, right? When was that published?
That was published 2 years ago. And that book is very, very popular with, I just sent a book to Australia. I just sent a book to Iceland. It's very popular with intelligence organizations. And it's designed for intelligence organizations because it really is a history book. It has a lot of the declassified top secret documents that I was talking about quoted within the book. So it's a learning tool for secret agents of today. Those who are fighting with in the Middle East and wherever else. So it's very popular with those organizations.
I see. Well, I'll put that in the show notes. I'll put a link to the new book, also a link to your website. And again, the author's name is Lynn Philip Hodgson, and the book we talked about today is Inside Camp X. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Stay there. Stay there.